What's happening, internet? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Adrian, aka Fomex Cosplay. The Wandavision series ended yesterday and it took us through a wild ride into the MCU's more magical future. With the benefit of hindsight, let's take a journey back into Westview and see how Wanda and Vision's little misadventure sets up the future of the MCU and how the rest of the Marvel Cinematic Universe play out. Spoilers ahead, of course. Let's do it. The WandaVision series focuses primarily on Wanda Maximoff as well as her new husband, Vision. The two of them move together to Westview, New Jersey to try to set up their normal, peaceful, quiet life. We see the bond that the two of them share, being absolutely romantic sweethearts, suffering only the mildest bit of hijinks at the hands of a miscommunication left by a heart on their calendar. We're then transported to the 1960s, where their biggest problem is trying to blend into the town. It's at this point where Wanda slowly realizes that things are not as they seem when she sees a Sikorsky helicopter toy that's colored in a world full of black and white. She's then later also interrupted by a voice on the radio who calls out to her saying, "Wanda, who's doing this to you, Wanda?" Before we get any definitive answers, however, Wanda's pregnant, which means that her and Vision's family life is about to reach its next stage. The next episode takes us into the 1970s, where we see Wanda and Vision coping with the fact that Wanda's getting pregnant at a rate much faster than the average person. And it culminates in Wanda giving birth to healthy baby boys, twins, just like her. And here we get to see her first real break from the immersion of the sitcom life that she's made for herself and go back to being the real Wanda, the Wanda that has to deal with all the trauma. Episode 4 finally takes us outside of Wanda's world, where we see Captain Monica Rambeau reconning the Westview anomaly, reuniting us as well with Agent Jimmy Woo from Ant-Man and Dr. Darcy Lewis from the Thor movies. The three of them make it a point to discover what's really going on inside and realize that Wanda may be pulling the strings on an entire town full of people. Before we get any real answers as to how Wanda managed to resurrect the Vision, we're returned back to the sitcom setting. Wanda and Vision's marriage evolves once again as they now become the doting parents to Billy and Tommy, the twins, who Wanda can't seem to control the way she controls the rest of the town. Vision's also slowly starting to discover what's really going on. Throughout this entire time, Wanda's dearest neighbor Agnes has been there to help in every episode and always appearing whenever things aren't going entirely as planned for the couple. This episode focuses on teaching a lesson. We can't bring back the dead, no matter how hard we try. The kids learned this the hard way when they see their new pet dog Sparky biting the dust in Agnes's backyard. The kids plead with their mom to resurrect their dog, but she tells them that she can't do that, and sometimes we just have to learn to move forward, which is advice she really should be taking herself. Vision finally confronts Wanda on what she's doing to the people stuck in the hex. Another twist is thrown into the formula, this time with her brother Pietro appearing. He doesn't look like the real Pietro, but he does look mighty familiar. Meanwhile, back in the real world, Darcy, Jimmy, and Monica are still figuring out a way to re-enter the Hex, as Director Hayward continues to antagonize Wanda as well as demonize her. This leads to Monica to want to use a mobile fallout shelter to try to penetrate back into the Hex. Moving on to the 1990s, early 2000s episode of the show, we finally have kids in Westview, and it's Halloween. The perfect time to go about dressed in comic-accurate costumes which don't normally look well on screen. Vision's off to patrol the neighborhood that night, which Wanda clearly does not agree with, but it's okay because Uncle Pietro's got the kids. The siblings go off to chaperone the siblings on their neighborhood trick-or-treat, while Vision goes off to further the plot. Monica's team gets in hot water with Director Hayward, leaving Monica and Jimmy to go get their roving fallout shelter, while Darcy stays behind to gather intelligence on what Hayward's actually planning with the Vision. Pietro tries picking Wanda's mind, trying to see how she managed to do what she did with the town of Westview. Wanda doesn't have any answers for him or for us the audience and leaves it up to Vision to drive the point home. Vision meets Agnes and she convinces him to try to investigate what's outside the Hex. He bursts out and is confronted by sword agents, who he promptly tells to save the people inside as he's about to disintegrate. Billy feels this, and Wanda uses this as a pretext to expand the Hex. This leads us to our 2010s episode, where we see Wanda, who's extremely tired from all the magic she had to pull. The kids are freaking out, and Wanda seems not too fazed by this. She's at this point lost the ability to really care for anyone or anything, and decides to treat herself to a quarantine staycation, which is what all of us have been doing for the past year. Wanda neglects her responsibility so hard that she just ignores the fact she's losing her control over Westview and immediately hands her kids off to her dear neighbor Agnes. Vision, meanwhile, breaks Darcy free of her honk-honk hold and takes a ride with her back to the center of town where they keep encountering roadblocks. It's at this point where Vision finally realizes who he used to be and how Wanda really needs him. Meanwhile, on the outside world, Monica tries breaching through the hex, which doesn't go too well for her hyped-up rover, and she's forced to cross it herself. She jumps right in, has her superhero origin story, and jumps out the other end, now as Spectrum. She runs straight to Wanda's house where Wanda throws her out, only to realize that she's now superpowered. She comforts and confronts Wanda about the truth, and how we can't escape it, we just have to live with it. As she's about to get through to Wanda, Agnes comes in to rescue her. Wanda realizes that Agnes doesn't have the kids anymore, and Agnes tricks her into heading to the basement. She sees all the witch magic going on in Agnes's basement, and is in for a complete shock, which everyone in the audience predicted that Agnes was actually the witch, Agatha Harkness, and that she was there to try to figure out how Wanda made her hex in the first place. So we take a journey back through Wanda's personal history, starting with her childhood in Sokovia. She grew up loving sitcoms, which gave her her view of the West, her West view, if you will. These were the last moments in her life where she was truly happy, and they are the only things that provide her comfort in this world. Wanda's parents are immediately in a bombing raid as she and Pietro cower under a table. At this point, we realize that Wanda actually stopped the bomb from exploding in the first place, and that she had latent magic abilities since she was a kid, where then led to her time in Hydra, where we see her interacting with the Mind Stone, showing her a vision of a possible future. At this point, we know that Wanda was born with her abilities, but she would have lost it were they not enhanced by her interacting with the Mind Stone. We then see her at Avengers compound in between Age of Ultron and Civil War, where she interacts with Vision, and Vision helps her to cope a bit with her grief, not only with his company, but with his philosophical advice. This shows us that part of Wanda's humanity was brought about because of her robot boyfriend, and when he was dead, she had nothing left. This leads us finally to Sword headquarters, where she confronts Director Hayward on his chopping up Vision's body. We get a big twist when we realize that Wanda didn't actually take Vision's body away from Sword, and that she created Vision completely out of her grief, which we see as she heads to Westview, New Jersey. This town mirrored Wanda's grief and loneliness. In her misery, she ended up roping them in, forcing them to put on wide, happy smiles as they actually suffered from her mental trauma. We see that Wanda created the hex in a moment of anguish, turning it into the 1950 setting we see in episode 1. This leads us back outside into the real world, where Agatha confronts Wanda, calling her, finally, the Scarlet Witch. Episode 9 takes us immediately to that same scene where Wanda manages to free the boys from Agatha's hold. She later drops a car on Agatha, just like the Wicked Witch of the East in Wizard of Oz. This leads us to see Hayward's secret weapon, the White Vision, who is actually Vision's real body, but reactivated to kill Wanda and Vision. We now have several fights going on, with Wanda fighting Agatha, our Vision fighting White Vision, Hayward fighting Jimmy Woo, as well as Monica fighting fake Pietro. Vision and White Vision then engage in a philosophical debate as to the nature of their existence and hit us with the ship of Theseus. They both decide that neither is the real ship and both are the real ship, which leads to White Vision accepting Green Vision's request to reignite Old Vision's memories, and he flies off to try to figure out what he really is. We see our Vision go back to his wife and his kids as she is confronted by the fact that she dumped her misery and her suffering on innocent people. Agatha says that she can make it stop, promising Wanda that in exchange for her powers, she would secure Westview. Agatha's whole deal this entire time was trying to steal the powers of the Scarlet Witch and keep it for herself. We see Wanda use the Hex as her rune display, and she drains Agatha of all of her powers. We're setting up for a happy ending which we all knew would come, but we didn't know how. Agatha's condemned to play Agnes, Wanda closes down the Hex, finally freeing the people of Westview, and we realize that she's finally learning to move on. We see her and Vision tuck in the kids one last time as she and Vision ponder as to what he really is. The two of them lovingly say goodbye, and the aftermath is that the FBI took over the scene as Wanda flies off. Our mid-credit scene shows Monica meets up with a Skrull who tells her they're taking her to space, setting her up for Captain Marvel 2. Meanwhile, in the post-credit scene, we see Wanda retreating to an isolated cabin. We see her astral project as the Scarlet Witch reading the Darkhold. Moving on to my own personal opinion of the show, I really love what Marvel did. They managed to introduce kids who've never seen real TV to the concept of cable television, situational comedies, and tying it perfectly into the story of one Wanda Maximoff. We see her in the Avengers as sort of the baby of the team, and we kind of gloss over the fact that her life has been nothing but constant misery and suffering, save for occasional appearances of sitcoms as well as the Vision's love for her. By the end of it, we're all left to deal with our own suffering, but the message of the show is that there is hope. It can't all be misery, it can't all be grief. We have to learn to live with our failures, we have to learn to live with our own personal problems, and that running away from our problems will not solve it. Only confronting it, processing it, and learning to move forward will we grow as people. Which is exactly what Wanda does throughout this show. She goes through the stages of grief, and only by the end of it does she finally reach acceptance of the fact that Vision died in Infinity War, and that the kids that she created won't survive in the real world. What is grief if not love, persevering? And that's the whole point of the show. Wanda must learn to grieve in order for her to keep moving forward. Because loving someone till death do you part doesn't mean that you join them, doesn't mean that you try to bring them back. We don't just live for ourselves, we also live for those who can't live anymore, who don't live anymore. And if you think about it, we got all of this from a show where basically Wanda handles her trauma by traumatizing an additional 5,000 people along with her, all while pretending to star in her own TV show. And that's the magic of what Marvel managed to accomplish here in giving us an entertaining show that had its comedic moments, that had its hijinks, that had its shenanigans, all while showing us under the surface that they know how to write characters that feel real, that have to deal with real human problems and have to deal with them in a real human way. Wanda has all this magic power, but still, she has to overcome grief like the rest of us by processing it, mourning, and moving forward. And that's a very powerful lesson that superheroes aren't immune from human desires. They shouldn't be. That's how you should write characters. For us as fans, we look at her story as a way to see her power explode. And once we see her power explode, that leads us perfectly into Doctor Strange 2, and it leads us perfectly into introducing the mutants in the MCU. We thought we'd get that with Pietro, and they lied to us. We thought we'd get Mephisto, and they misdirected us. But honestly, I'm not mad. I really loved the show. I really loved what WandaVision did. I loved all of the costumes, all of the sets. I loved how all of the recurring cast were utilized, and how we realized how they really had no choice. A lot of this show is about overcoming the fact that we had no choice in a lot of factors that created who we are. Vision's the clear representation of that. He's had no agency of his own. He served as Ultron's final form. He served with the Avengers, but he's never really had a life all to himself. And now he served as Wanda's substitute husband, who's also her real husband, who she never actually married husband. As much as it was about Wanda's grief, was also about Vision discovering who he could be as a person, and how we as people have agency. We have control. We may not have control over our circumstances, but we have control over what we do in a given situation. And that's what this show is about. It's about how we process the things that we can't control, how we control the things that are within our control. And that's a very positive lesson, beyond all of the wiggly woos shooting out, beyond all the VFX, beyond all the practical effects and production design, which is all fancy, by the way. I absolutely love it, especially the music and Agatha all along. That you could gain so much just watching WandaVision, especially if you have things that you're going through. It's a reflection as to how we cope with our problems. A lot of times we escape into TV. We escape from things that we should actually be facing. And TV's helped enable us to escape from our problems. And done right, entertainment should help to give people hope, to inspire people, to help keep them going. You know, it shouldn't force messages, it shouldn't teach us how to think. It should help us to process the things that we know. And sometimes it should just keep us occupied for half an hour. You know, sometimes you just want that. WandaVision really helps prove that point, that there's the reality we want, and there's the reality that we have. And we have to live with the reality that we're given, but that doesn't mean that we have to suffer all the time. You know, there's room for happiness. There's room for an escape. When it comes down to it, You have to face your truth. You have to own it. And because of this lesson that it's teaching us through such an entertaining, well-produced show with actors that are absolutely amazing at their role, especially Elizabeth Olsen and Catherine Hahn, Paul Bettany, even the kids were good. I appreciate WandaVision. I appreciate what it did. I appreciate how it showed commercials that delved into Wanda's psyche, and I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the show. I enjoyed watching every theory video that came out on it. The show only kind of falls for me because I get secondhand embarrassment, and watching the hijinks from the first 3 episodes was kinda for me. But that's just me though. So I give the show a 9 out of 10. As for how it ties into the rest of the MCU and Phase 4 in particular, we see that WandaVision happened 3 weeks after Avengers Endgame, and it happened 9 days after Wanda visited SWORD headquarters to try to reclaim the Vision and didn't actually take him. We see that Vision survived in some way as White Vision, and that he has his humanity, he has his memories, but he has to figure himself out. He can't be there for Wanda because that's not his arc. His arc is to figure out how he, as several different personalities in one body, should interact. Meanwhile, Wanda and her practicing dark magic sets up perfectly for Doctor Strange 2, especially as we hear Billy calling out to her. Her kids are still out there somewhere in the multiverse and she can find them. But the Scarlet Witch will need the help of the Sorcerer Supreme in Doctor Strange 2, and I'm actually pretty excited for that. We also see Monica set up for Captain Marvel 2, which I'm not as excited for, but I like Monica. I like her character development. My friend also asked me at this point, what does it mean now that Wanda's confirmed to be a witch and not necessarily a mutant that can bring in the MCU, the X-Men? And well, Wanda being a witch, it just ties us more directly into the comics and ties us more into the magic. Because we've seen the science and the cosmic aspect of the MCU throughout the Infinity Saga. So now in this saga, we're going to get more of all of the old gods like Chthon, all of the demons like Mephisto. So this means that it helps us get into another aspect of the MCU that we haven't seen before. So it's merely expanding the amount of Marvel that we can see on screen, and well, I appreciate that. He also asked me what the difference is between sorcerers and witches now that both are firmly planted in the MCU, and well, at this point, I figure that sorcerers practice magic that's not really tied to any old gods, but more tied in the use of magic itself, the protection of realities, for example. Meanwhile, I'd say that witches are tied more to a specific entity who they draw their powers from. Both sorcerers and witches in the MCU can interact with magic much the same way. They probably have the same books, they have the same abilities. But I'd say since the sources of their magic are different and the purposes of their magic are different, that's where it differs really. That's how WandaVision sets up the future of the MCU, and I can't wait for the rest of it, and I can't wait for 2 weeks from now when we finally see Cap? Not exactly.